Hi, I'm Gerald Finken and I'm CEO of RxE2, and I've been bringing you a series of webinars talking about this new model that I'd like the industry to adopt that's going to change the way we do clinical supplies, all for the better, most importantly, all better for the patient. We talk about E2 Dispensing, which again is incorporating the practice of pharmacy into clinical research. That's what RxE2 is about. E2 Dispensing is that practice of pharmacy in the way we're going to handle clinical supplies. I've talked to you about the patient-centric supplies, again, patient-facing, why the E2 Dispensing is patient-centric. And I've talked to you about the ARR pricing, which is changing the way we're going to be charging for clinical supplies. We've got to reduce the cost of clinical supplies. So today, my session is going to be on the flexibility, planning flexibility of working in the E2 model, and really just go over a couple things for those who are interested in this model. Think about the importance of this new model on our everyday work life. So to start with, what I want you to think about is we need to change from a production-based thinking to a pharmacy-based thinking. Now, the production-based is really the way we've been for the past 40 years. And that's all under that GMP environment, thinking that we have to somehow give GMP supplies directly to the patient, where that's really not how it works in the real world. And I'll talk about that in a second. So this traditional production-based planning is the way we've done it for quite a long time, and anybody who's been in clinical supplies knows these things and deals with these on a day-to-day basis, especially the project managers. And I really enjoyed my time as a project manager and figuring this stuff out and making it all work, and I got pretty good at it. The first thing, of course, we talk about is the planning, right? Is the forecasting of supplies. That comes in a couple ways of thinking about is, how much bulk do we have? And many times it's limited, and it's going to come in, various times throughout the study, so we don't have all up front. But also then we have to start thinking about, how are we going to package and label supplies to seed the sites? So we have some in inventory in our warehouse, then we're going to send some to the sites, and of course we could also send some to the depots. And so this is part of a forecasting planning model that you can run algorithms with to model it to say what if scenarios, what if sites don't enroll, etc. Of course, then the other thing is the timelines. This is always critical. And I kind of did this backwards. Actually, I'll go to this planning first. When I wrote this out, I did it backwards. So first comes all the planning for this. And it used to take me about 40 hours as a project manager, right, to design what it was going to look like. We created these packaging and labeling requirements, and it took about 40 hours to prepare that. And in that, we take a look at eventually, what is it that we're going to end up with? And it could get much more complex than this. Where they have 4 bottles in a kit, or kits in a shipper, et cetera. But what's that going to look like? What labels are going to be on the bottles? What labels are going to be on the kit? What labels are going to be on the shipper? And of course, we talk about that. And of course, then a lot of it had to do with batch records. How many batch records do we have to run? Because each time you came up with a lot, it'd be a new batch record. So you'd have a batch for the bottling of the active, a batch record for the bottling of the placebo, you'd have a batch record for the assembly into kits, and if you had another batch record, kits into shippers. And so, of course, there was a way of, in the planning processes, of how to reduce the number of batch records while still maintaining control in a manufacturing GMP facility. There's also thinking about, the site storage, about how much are we going to store at each site, the planning of the inventory. There's going to be the site selections, how the site selects supplies. And this is one of those things I had an epiphany one day, thinking to myself that most of the work I did in this planning phase was for the site. It wasn't for the patient. It was thinking about how is a site going to receive it, store it, know how to go get it, pull something out, and give it to the patient. And of course, maintaining that inventory, etc. So most of what I did was really about all around what the site usage was going to be. And I call that site facing. Along with that, of course, is the labeling itself, which even the generation of the labels, most of the information on a clinical label, clinical supplies label, is for the site. There are the instructions for the patient, like use as directed, but even that really wasn't for the patient, is it? because that's helping out the site and the manufacturer plan or use supplies more generically. And I'll talk about some of those ways that we did in the past. So anyhow, even the labeling, when you think about a protocol number, that's not patient facing, that's really for the study site. Randomization number, that's not for the patient, that's for the study site to be able to select based upon protocol and randomization number the right kit. They could be color coded, etc. Of course, again, this whole thing I mentioned before in one of my previous episodes about expiry dates, you're not having them on there. And the sites, of course, have a different way of receiving that information. And of course, some of the things too is just how to apply the depots and the sites, like I mentioned. So these were just typical planning aspects that would go into the packaging and labeling. Of course, then you'd actually move into the packaging and labeling. So this planning, implementing it, you know, getting the labels, the label proofs done, getting batch records created and approved, scheduling the production runs, getting the kits made, getting them approved, getting them released, putting them in inventory. And that could take up to 3 to 6 months, unless you want to pay expedited charges, which I know are available. So this is the typical packaging and labeling planning process. There's a lot more to it, trust me, than that. But I want to start thinking to move to the pharmacy-based thinking and think about E2 dispensing and the planning in this new model. I'll jump right to the bottom, and what I want you to think about is what happens in the commercial world. Once a drug's approved, right, it goes into the commercial world. So you have bulk, goes to a pharmacy, and a pharmacy dispense. And so if you think about that, let's think about how much forecasting is needed. Well, in clinical supplies, many times you only have like, you know, a third of what you need produced at any one time because it's limited to drug supplies. So you would just take the supplies you know you need for clinical and send it to the pharmacy. So not much in the way of forecasting, really, because it's all just going to this one pharmacy that's going to supply the entire US or in Europe, a specific country. So the idea of how much forecasting really limits because you don't have any of the sites issues and or even the depot issues at this point. The timelines associated with this. So when I think before, like I'll flip this around, the planning, let's talk about the planning of the dispensing. So it took me 40 hours to plan for how I was going to package and label in traditional. Now it only takes me about 4 hours to prepare the pharmacy manual about how the pharmacy is going to handle the supplies. And that time is like, for me as a project manager, I think I could do 10 projects versus 1 project, greatly improving my ability to do work as a project manager. And then flipping that around, once you have it planned, really the timelines, like there's not 3 to 6 months, it's the bulk's at the pharmacy, really it just happens, right? Within, you know, like the beginning, I guess in the start, the 1 to 2 days just to make sure it's running properly, you know, and the shipment request or the prescriptions coming to the pharmacy dispensed and shipped. So it's really just like a 1-day turnaround to get the prescription, fill it, and overnight it to a patient. So the timelines there, that 3 to 6 months just are eliminated. I think about that. That's and if you think about in the commercial world, when a pharmacy gets the bulk, which is usually overnight with all the wholesaler distributors, right? The prescription comes in filled, you know, hopefully you're only spending 20 minutes on pharmacy, but it actually takes the pharmacist 2 to 4 minutes to fill that prescription. And you know, so a different mindset and planning based, which is you start thinking about it, go item by item about the difference between traditional and pharmacy, you're going to see this gets pretty simple. Then what I want to talk about is the flexibility. Now, in my career in packaging and labeling over the years, you know, the just-in-time labeling was one of the first things that came out to give us flexibility. And that is you didn't label something until it went out the door to give you flexibility in the bulk drug supplies you had, 30-count bottles, we'll say. You know, so you can do investigator IND, but you could also maybe supply your phase 2 trial. Of course, with that, there was not very much kitting or anything going on, so we're not really talking about complicated site type dispensings. The other thing was the pooling of supplies, which they came up with, that the idea that you again have package label supplies and that you could use them across protocols. So again, it became more programmatic in the design of this, but again, it's still all produced up front. Most of it's produced up front. And of course, the original one that I was going down my list, I was like, oh yeah, booklet labels was the beginning of it all. They had like 13 pages in a booklet, which takes like 3 months to get prepared so that you can go into multiple countries. Pretty interesting, again, the pre-preparation. As I look at this, again, to me, this is all site-facing stuff. This is all of what makes an ability for the site to dispense. Get it to a site, and to have flexibility to which sites you send it to, and of course, then the site to have it to be able to dispense to the patient. I then came up with the on-demand, and I talked about that, about the flexibility and to reduce waste, that you didn't do any packaging and labeling until a shipment request came in. So there's upfront activities that went on. You had to have batch records in a GMP facility. But then you get into this on-demand, which was the beginning of bringing the practice of pharmacy into clinical research. And of course, then the direct-to-patient, which to me, again, the on-demand is still site-facing because those supplies are going to the site. And again, be a kit. You'd produce the same kit with the same site information, the kit box for the site to use it and dispense it. But then we got to direct-to-patient, and then things really started to change. And that's how, like for me, I got to the next stage. You know, we did this 20 years ago when I was at CSM, the on-demand and direct-to-patient. But now with the decentralized clinical trials, it's really come to light about just what you can do with the direct-to-patient. The issue, of course, is pricing. And like I said, with the ARR, we've taken care of that. But this is the first time it's patient-facing because now you have these supplies going directly to a patient. And that's what got me thinking, well, wait a minute, instead of coming out of a GMP facility where you have to follow the structure because it's trained individuals instead of licensed individuals doing the quote dispensing, you know, there's absolutely the quality review and processes have to be in place. Not to say they're not at the pharmacy level, but at the pharmacy level, it's the state licensure where the pharmacist is both the dispenser and the quality checks in the process because they're licensed and not just trained. So one of the things with this, you know, through this flexibility though, is what happens, what about change? This is one type of change, but I'm talking about real world, everyday change if you start changing on a patient level. And this comes into some of the issues here about the direct-to-patient. They want it at their home, they want it at their vacation spot, they want it to the clinical site. That's some of these changes that we're talking about. But what happens if the patient wants to change dose? What happens if the patient gets on a medicine that the doctor doesn't want that patient to be on while they're on this clinical trial? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to put that stuff on the label real time? That's when we start getting into the flexibility of dispensing from your central fill pharmacy, from the pharmacies. And if you think about it, it's real-time labeling. They're produced real-time based upon a real-time prescription. It's real-time packaging. You want 15 tablets, 20 tablets, 30 tablets in a bottle? You want 2 vials dispensed at a time? You want 4 vials dispensed? Real-time packaging and labeling. And of course, the other thing is what I love is the real-world patient experience. This is what they know and are used to. They know when they go to the doctor, they get a prescription, they go to the pharmacy is going to give them their month's worth of medication. It's not going to be where they're going to come home with a kit, you know, or some GMP label that has a protocol number and a randomization number on, not their name on it. It really, you know, it's not patient-facing and not what I would say a real-world patient experience. We're changing that. All aspects is patient-facing in this model. It really is about what does the patient want, need, and see. I think one of the key things that I want to talk about here, though, too, is the same thing. What about change? What do you do about change here? In the other model, you want change, you've got to go back and go through the entire process of batch records, labels, and maybe it takes 3 to 6 months to implement a change. Here, like I mentioned, the pharmacy manager gets updated the prescription. You could do 1 to 2 changes, I mean dramatic changes in the way you want supplies handled. Very upfront. But the real key to this is that you're dealing with the practice of pharmacy. And that in this model, when I talk about this dispensing and flexibility, is that you have a pharmacist counseling the patient because that's required by law. When medication, any drug is dispensed to a patient, pharmacists have to counsel. And in this model, when the patient needs updated information, the doctor has information once given to the patient, the pharmacist is licensed and able to do that. And that's what creates, I think, the true flexibility of the feedback loop, real time, of what the patient's telling the pharmacist feeds back to the doctor, the next prescription comes with the change already incorporated. And I look forward to going on with these webinars. The next one I'm going to talk about the FAQs, because I know you have a lot of questions, and I'm hoping I'm going to answer some of the key questions in my next webinar. So please join me for my next webinar. All right, thank you very much.